This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. A quick hello from me, Angelica Slinska, to all of the listeners. I'm here to share that for this episode, we have partnered with the Nursery Management Show, which is taking place on the 29th and 30th of November 2024 in London. Stuart Cloke, our guest on this episode, will actually be speaking at the show as part of a panel discussion all around recruitment and retention, specifically around men in childcare. So do check out the discussion at the show and come and take part for yourself. More information can be found via the link in this episode description. Enjoy this episode and don't forget to share on socials with your own thoughts, practice, and experience. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Slinska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Stuart Cloke, who is Head of Early Years at a small group of nurseries across Essex. Thank you very much, Stuart, for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. It's great to have you on. I know we've talked about this for a little while. So yeah, it's brilliant to finally have a recording. So today we are discussing inquiry-led learning. That's a great start, isn't it? Because this is something, Stuart, that you have started looking into recently and implementing in your setting. So inquiry-led, like planning and that whole approach. So this episode is very much practice-based and reflecting on the use of the approach in settings. So firstly, a little intro on the approach. So inquiry-led learning is an approach whereby the focus of learning stems from a question, often sparked by the children, but may also be sparked by the adult, and from there then led by the children. And we'll discuss this a little bit more in terms of how it's facilitated by the adult. And this approach is focused on fostering an inquisitive and curious mindset within children and really encouraging them to question, explore, find out, and build on their knowledge. And inquiry-led learning is often connected to the Reggio Emilia approach, where the adult and child are co-researchers and they discover the world around them together. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about this as well in terms of co-researching. So that's kind of our little introduction to the approach, a very brief one. And now we'll kind of talk about it, how it's working out in practice. So Stuart, what led you to be interested in this approach, I guess, in changing your current approach to planning and pedagogy and how you support children's learning?
Yeah, I think this came from me specifically doing some research, and I always like to keep up to date with the most current research and the patterns and trends in the early years and what's working and maybe what's not working. And as we know, we've seen a huge shift from traditional planning formats to much more responsive planning, particularly things such as in the moment, which this does incorporate a little bit, but they're obviously two separate approaches and two separate processes. But I think for me, within our setting, we just looked at the cohort of children that we had and that we were receiving in the new term, and we just felt that this was going to be a really nice holistic approach to incorporating those children's interests and abilities and skill sets, and just it leans itself much more into facilitating the different learning styles children present with and the way that children learn. So I just think for us it was a much more child-focused approach, and it's not something we've ever done before, but I've got a number of friends who work in kind of primary education, who work in schools that specifically do inquiry-led curriculums throughout their kind of provisions, right from, reception to year 6. So kind of it is a working and successful model. And I just think for us, that curiosity is key for us. So we really wanted to find something that worked for us.
Yeah, so it's really interesting there. There's two things that I want to kind of focus on that you said there in terms of inquiry-led curriculum. So it's not just an inquiry-led approach to an existing curriculum that already has been created, kind of packaged up for anyone and everyone, but actually what you're talking about is these other settings, and perhaps maybe what you're moving towards too as well. The whole curriculum is very much inquiry-led rather than just the approach to it, but which kind of makes a lot of sense because, you know, it all comes hand in hand. And then another thing, actually, you mentioned like keeping on top of like current research, but also like trends and things like that. And that's something I think we need to be almost like mindful and careful of in early years, because there's so many trends, you know, as you say, out there. And it's so easy to just jump on something and not do the research. Like you said, you've been kind of looking into it and researching and reading instead of just jumping into it and thinking, I'll just copy someone. And it reminds me of that kind of focus of that child-led planning, very much, you know, what we hear or know as is not just simply about thinking this child is loving playing with trains and that's what I see them doing every day and this is their interest. So let's give them more of train-based stuff and plan this in resources-wise, activity-wise. This is like oversimplified. And it's about going deeper into the interest, the learning involved, and the skills the child may be developing or, you know, can potentially develop. And that's all kind of led by that inquisitiveness, questioning, inquiry, rather than just, I see them playing with this, that's their interest, let's just give them more of that. So yeah, there's a lot of like really, like you said, understanding your children, your cohort, kind of like what you're doing now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a real shift in mindset as well for the practitioner, the teacher, the educator. It's not just a moment where you think, oh, a child is really into a dinosaur or a train. That isn't what inquiry-led curriculum or inquiry-led planning is. It's really about, yes, using motivators and areas of interest to facilitate that curiosity, to go beyond just that surface level interest to a much wider awareness. And like you said, that co-research element is really important within inquiry-led planning. It's if they don't know the answer and maybe you don't know the answer, let's find out together. Let's get a book, let's watch a video, let's find something that we can get the answer to together. So I think that mindset is really important, and approaching it in the right way is really key. Otherwise it just won't work.
Yeah. And in your article, I think you do mention that it is mindset over like essentially like a procedure or a process. It is very much about how does the educator think about the child's learning. It is the whole pedagogy, isn't it? Rather than when we're now suddenly doing this planning in terms of this is what it looks like practically or on a piece of paper. So in terms of like planning for children's learning and supporting their learning prior to this, what do you still do? What are you phasing out of? What did you used to do in your settings?
Yeah, so we're definitely phasing out more of the prescriptive pre-planning element of the curriculum, you know, deciding something a week ahead or a couple of weeks ahead, because we just find that doesn't work. You know, the interests and the abilities of the children change in such a fast pace now.
Yeah.
It's not really appropriate. We still really utilize, you know, that line of development. So within our settings, we focus on what we call our possible lines of development. So they're initial sparks or initial interests of things. So a topic, or it could be that they've been to the circus over the summer and they're starting juggling balls or something like that. So we kind of really focus on that possible line of development and see how that links into what we can provide in our continuous provision and our ongoing environment, which obviously is super, super crucial when we're looking at an inquiry-led classroom or an inquiry-led curriculum. Is that environment's really important as well. So I think definitely moving away from the prescriptive element of that pre-planning and really focusing and utilising those possible lines of development. And as that, you know, phrase lends itself to, that word possible is really key, because it's a possible line of development. It doesn't mean it's going to lead anywhere. It could mean it leads somewhere else. So again, it's having that open mindset to know that things will change. You'll need to adapt as a practitioner, as a teacher, as an educator, in order to keep up to date with that emerging interest and that emerging inquiry.
It seems like this approach is so much more focused on the educator and being reflective and really active, rather than just thinking, I'm just going to plan something and then we're going to do it. And I might then reflect on how that's turned out. Actually, it's constantly reflecting on your feet in that moment with the children. And like we keep mentioning, co-researching together. It's a very fluid approach, isn't it?
yeah, it has that freedom. And, with that initial question, you might start off with an initial inquiry question of, what is an emergency, or what is a habitat, or how do we keep ourselves healthy? But by the end of it, you've kind of sparked these different lines of inquiries. You've then spoken about, your body and, kind of the food, and that could lead a whole new inquiry. What food do we eat? So it's having that freedom, whereas in things such as like the national curriculum and even the EYFS, that they can be quite prescriptive, and this is what children need to achieve, and this is what children need to do. And that's fine. We all need to work towards those developmental milestones, but I think with a much more open approach to kind of, it could change and it should change, really.
Yes, and so many educators do still worry about that word curriculum because it is very primary based, and that's kind of where it came from. We didn't used to even use the term until a couple of years ago. And it's important to remember that the EYFS is not a curriculum, and development matters and birth to 5 matters are not curricula, and they are guidance, or they are the statutory frameworks. And like you say, there's all those outcomes there and things like that. And it's very much to kind of focus the practitioners on it or guide them. But the curriculum should really come from the child, the children, the groups, the cohorts. And that's where the work really comes in, isn't it? In terms of implementing all your knowledge and then reflecting on the children and bringing it all together and really creating something that is entirely bespoke rather than taking a curriculum off the shelf.
Yeah, and that fluidity of that curriculum is really important. Year on year, your curriculum could change. Term on term, elements of your curriculum could change because you need to adapt to that cohort of children, those abilities. You need to make sure that children are constantly getting opportunities to critically think and plan and take appropriate risks and all of that. So that should all be built into your curriculum every day and every term and every week. And you should be having ongoing and open discussions about, do we need to review this? Do we need to reflect on this? Do we need to change this? Do we need to scrap it completely? Is it no longer working? And I think, that term curriculum can often be confused with pedagogical approaches such as, the curiosity approach or Montessori. They're all ways of doing things. And, to an element, so is inquiry-led planning. So they're all kind of approaches, but it's kind of making sure they fit in with your ethos and your vision of your setting, the cohort of your children. It very much depends on what area your settings are in as well, the families that you serve. So there's a whole bigger picture you need to take into consideration before kind of, as you said, just taking a curriculum off the shelf and saying that works for us, or that's the new shiny one that everyone's doing, so we're going to do that. It might not work for you at all, and actually that's going to cause a detriment to their development because they're just not ready for that.
Hi, it's Angelica here. Thank you all for listening in. I'm here to ask for a quick favour from the early years community. In order for the Voice of Early Childhood to continue creating free, valuable content and sharing voices, we need your help. Please hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening on. And if you are listening on a podcast platform, then check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can not only listen, but also watch the podcast and really focus in on the discussions. Or if you are viewing on YouTube already, remember that you can also find us on 19 different podcast platforms. Simply search for The Voice of Early Childhood and subscribe to get a brand new episode every Monday morning, ready for your morning commute or however you start your week. And as always, do share the podcast with colleagues, friends, and parents of young children. We have a lot of interested parents and family members listening in and reading the articles. So let's ensure more of them can access the free content. Let's encourage them to engage and keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the environment already. So it's really important to ensure, in your article, actually, you also mentioned that it's crucial that the environment lends itself to an inquiry mindset and that approach, and continuous provision you mentioned there as well. So what have you kind of started doing in your settings to to change the environment, or did you need to change it at all? And what do you mean by high quality continuous provision as well? Because actually that's something I think recently on LinkedIn, there was a conversation, a post about the fact that continuous provision is one of those terms that we do use a lot, but many times kind of don't really know what it means anymore, or people use it for different things, and actually it's not really what it used to be anymore. So I guess, what do you see as high quality continuous provision?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that term continuous provision, again, is one that's really blown up over the last couple of years, and there seems to be a lot of discussions about it, which is great, but there also seems to be like lots of confusion around it as well. Continuous provision isn't just making sure you've got a sand and water tray in the room. Of course, yeah, you should have access to that, but that isn't just your continuous provision. When we're talking about high quality continuous provision and linking it to inquiry-led learning, you've got to just make sure you've got the equipment and the resources to facilitate those success criteria for those children. So if you're doing an inquiry on, baking and cooking, and, you're actually doing some hands-on baking, do you have whisks in the role play for them to practice those kind of skills when they're not baking, to develop their fine and gross motor skills? Do you have, mark making available in all your areas so you can practice, writing shopping lists and mark making and drawing pictures? And, one big part of the inquiry-led planning, which really facilitates that skill, is the different stages. You get to a stage within the inquiry where you collate your research that you've learned together so far, your results and stuff. So again, all those skills within mark making will then be really prevalent, and knowing whether you've hit those markers to get those children where they need to be. But without that high quality continuous provision, that high quality environment, children should be able to go into areas and parts of the rooms and be able to kind of have access to things that they can practice squeezing, juicing, ripping, cutting, all those really core physical skills, but also all those cognitive skills, problem solving in the physical area. Can they climb? Can they crawl? Can they squat? Can they jump? Because when we then go on to talk about maybe an inquiry question around, how do we keep healthy, they're going to have a lot of those pre-built skills already because of your continuous provision. So I think we did like environmental audits. We kind of walked around our settings and our environments and looked at whether they lend themselves to that curiosity approach, and that curiosity learning, and, making sure that those children have access to those equipment safely and securely, even when you're not there, because that's a big part of continuous provision, isn't it? It's ensuring that's provision that they can access and develop themselves and their skills in the absence of an adult as well, because they can't be everywhere all the time. So it's making sure, do they have resources to practice those skills by themselves as well as during those adult inputs, really.
Yeah, I really love that you mentioned here practicing skills, because actually I've not really heard people link continuous provision very often with practicing skills. It is just a lot more kind of surface level in terms of, what can children access, what can they play with that they're familiar with. So it's really great to hear that you're talking about linking everything together. So linking those projects, the inquiry-led projects that the children are doing with the adults, or in groups with each other, linking that to the day-to-day, to data continuous provision. So like you say, they can practice those skills everywhere and anywhere, and they're building on that knowledge and the skill sets. And that's really kind of thinking about practice deeper and linking all the areas, outdoors, indoors, things like that, rather than just thinking, what shall I put in this tough tray because it's empty? I'll just put some of these stickle bricks in, or whatever else. It just seems like a lot deeper kind of practice. And this kind of moves me on to thinking with your teams, because you're across different settings, aren't you? What's the response been there? Because obviously, like we just said, there's a lot more reflection needed from educators, deeper thinking. The planning is different. Some may feel like it might be a little bit more challenging, maybe, or even time consuming. How have you found that working with your teams?
Yeah, so I guess every approach and every process that you do within early years does have pros and cons. And I suppose if you had to be super reflective on something like inquiry-led planning, one of the potential drawbacks is that it's much more time consuming than, say, a prescriptive formula that you use for pre-planning, because that's already done for you, you know what you're doing. Whereas an inquiry approach is ongoing, it's continuous, it doesn't just stop. You could be doing it over 6 weeks rather than just a 6-hour day. You could be doing it over a 6-week period. So I think the challenges with that is that for maybe team members who are used to that pre-prescribed planning, coming away from that and really just engaging at that deeper and wider level can be challenging. You've got to make sure as a practitioner and as an educator, you're highly skilled to be able to do that. You've got to be able to be open to be challenged and come across things that maybe you're not familiar with. We don't all know the names of all the dinosaurs in the world, or we don't know all the names of the landmarks but that's fine. We don't have to, but we have to have a mindset and a willingness to learn together. And that co-research comes into play again, and facilitating that learning and that success for them. So I think, it can be challenging for teams. And again, it depends on the cohort of children. You may get some backlash in terms of that's not going to work, that won't work for us. And I think sometimes it won't, but you've got to have that willingness to try and move forward. And, the whole point of this mindset and approach and process is the reflective element. It's the ability to change and adapt and refocus where you need to go. So, it does lend itself to that element of that. So I don't think that should necessarily be seen as a drawback.
Yeah. And that reflective element is really supporting the practitioners, upskilling them, because, like you say, educators do need to be highly skilled to be able to really successfully work with this kind of approach. And it is really fluid and reflective. And so you do need those skills in order to be able to work with the approach. But whilst you're trying to work with it, you may not have all of those skills or be used to being very reflective and not on your feet, but you are developing those skills as you go along. So I guess it's great for a variety of practitioners, from those who may be starting their journey and they're learning a lot through this process, and those who maybe have been in early years for a while, but have used very different approaches and, especially to planning and things like that. So is there a lot involved in terms of like leadership? I guess I kind of want to say training, but maybe more informal training.
Yeah, I think informal training is definitely the most appropriate for this. You don't need kind of super detailed formal training. As long as you know the stages of how an inquiry model works, then really, going back to your point around different team members with different skill sets, you can use all of them within this process. So there may be, let's say you've got an apprentice, they could just ask the question. All they need to do is just ask the inquiry question. How do you think we can stay healthy this week at nursery? Or how did you travel to school this morning or this week? And then another more skilled practitioner can kind of do some of that deeper learning and kind of do that co-research element. And then maybe you've got a team member who does, heavily lean on that more prescribed formula. So they were able to they can be your research person. They can put all your evidence together. So it definitely should be a collaborative process, and really utilizing everybody's individual skill sets is really key within that.
That's really interesting, actually, because that really made me think it's such a great way to really capitalize on the various skill sets of your team and not just expect everyone to pick this up and be great at every single part of it. It's really recognizing each individual team members' differences, just like we do with children anyway. And I know in your article, actually, you mentioned that, and then earlier you said like it really supports children with different learning styles and needs, and it's really neuro-affirming, this approach. But yeah, it made me think that for adults, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's so open and it's got so much freedom within it that really it can suit any learning style or any any kind of learning need, or it can, anything that it need, you adapt it around you. It's very open, it's very fluid. It doesn't have a predetermined outcome. It doesn't have a set way of doing things. You can, if you feel the evidence or the learning isn't there, you can go back a stage. It really is open. But yeah, in terms of neuro-affirming, it allows that collaboration. It allows people with really specific interests, and those really high motivated elements of it, they can really show off their skills and what they know about dinosaurs or trains. Or they can really kind of show it as a success rather than often seeing it as a challenge in the more formal learning.
And when you mentioned formal learning, actually just now, I'm thinking that some educators and parents as well would be worried about the fact that we may not be incorporating that more formal learning in this. Where's the sitting down and writing, where's the maths, where's the literacy? And actually it's all about bringing in all of that, which we should be doing in early years anyway, regardless of the approach, bringing it into everything that we're doing with the children, bringing it into play. So it's not about sitting down and learning how to write or how to count. It's bringing it into the day-to-day routines, bringing those skills in through children's interests. Actually, Jan de Biel talks a lot about this, and he talks about core knowledge, specific knowledge, and all these kinds of things that we kind of delve deeper into. But on the surface of it, really, it is about bringing everything into a real life, everyday or play-based context, and not just let's now sit down and do maths as if it's a separate thing and we don't actually engage in it day to day. As adults, we do maths all the time. So I think it's just having, like you say, it's a mindset shift, isn't it? In terms of how do we see children's learning? How do we see learning and play as the same thing? That's really debatable as well. But yeah, so I guess, have you already had any kind of challenges there in terms of, and I don't know if you are already kind of very play-based anyway, but in terms of like, how do we have any educators or maybe even parents said, but what about if the child always shows these inquiries and curiosities, but then there's no maths in there or there's no literacy? Have you had anything like that?
Yeah, I think from a practitioner level, they seem to have really understood it. Obviously, for a lot of them, it is new. They haven't really come across it. There's not a huge amount of kind of, private early year settings, do it. So it's all very new to us as well. And we're learning as we go. We're co-researching with each other, and in terms of how we can get the best for our cohort. But in terms of parents, yes, there often are questions, will this still support my child in getting ready for school? Are they still going to be practicing their writing? And the short answer of that is, all of this and the way that we do the inquiry model, yes, it does. In the different stages of the inquiry-led planning model, there's opportunities to collate that research, and that could be, doing tally charts, which is your mark making and your maths. It's creating your bar charts. It's creating your, you could do a visual representation with the multi-link cubes of how tall people are. So, I think there's so many different elements that you can incorporate into that. And like you said, you don't then need to come away and do a whole separate maths input that they're not interested to. You can build maths into, the question, when you're dealing with things. So I think, making sure that as educators, we fully know the positives and the strengths of this will really kind of support that conversation that we have with parents and families around how this actually is going to be hugely beneficial. And we did as part of the changes in our preschool provision at this setting, we did like a preschool information morning. So parents came in and we gave them some information on the inquiry-led model and the processes and what that would involve. And when we explained it's incorporating your children's interests with an ability to kind of foster those skill sets, of course they were all for that. So I think it's in your delivery and it's in your approach and your mindset of how, if it's going to work, it's going to work. If you have that mindset of parents aren't going to like it, they're going to struggle, it just won't work, because you're setting yourself up to fail even before you've begun. So I think
Yeah.
Having those open conversations, those reflective conversations are really important. Stopping every, couple of weeks. All right, are we on track? How's their knowledge? Do we need to go back? It's very fluid, as we said earlier. So it should be great, really.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, like you say, you need to be confident about the approach, and probably well equipped, like evidence informed and equipped with, this is, like you said, why the approach works. This is why we're doing it. Here's kind of like my research or evidence or anything like that. And that obviously always convinces people a little bit more. And especially, if you're coming into it with that positive mindset. And as you were saying there about different examples of how children can learn the different areas of curriculum and the more formal based learning like maths and literacy, really reminded me of project based learning, which is essentially what we're talking about here as well. If they've got that inquiry, it turns into a bigger project. And again, very kind of Reggio Emilia based as well. And really, all of this is just incorporating holistic learning and development. That's kind of, I guess, the main message from all of this. And you mentioned, so like recording essentially data, like if children are doing a project, like recording how tall someone is and things like that, doing tally charts, which is amazing skills that children are learning at such a young age. It can be approached in a very developmentally appropriate way, even though some of these kind of skills are really complex. But this kind of moves me on to paperwork. So something that's important to discuss, I guess, in relation to inquiry-based learning is the documentation, because it's very much connected with that kind of those collaborative and visual kind of documentation methods, but not only to showcase and document the learning, and it's not really kind of just for the adults, but to provide children with the chance to share their voices and be that active participant and part of the process, and then kind of developing their learning further from the documentation itself. So what kind of approach have you taken to that? I know we kind of briefly before this recording also talked about floor books, and that if that's something that you may have done any kind of reading about or considering and implementing. But yeah, that's something that's quite a big topic, I guess.
Yeah, I think yeah, because the inquiry led process is so immersive and holistic and visual in many ways, that documentation is really key. And obviously at the heart of this approach is the children and the children's interests and the children's voices. So making sure you have a documented way of doing that and showcasing that is really important. The most typical way, most settings, schools that use this model is floor books. And obviously in schools, it gets a bit more different because you're going down different areas of learning. There might be a separate one for science. There might be a separate one for personal, social, and emotional development, all of that. But within an early years setting, you can put it all into one just big scrapbook. And it's called a floor book because the idea is that when you're putting those photos and quotes and evidence in there, it goes on the floor. You do it with the children. I think, it's a real good way. I think schools are more formalized in the sense that the children have a voice in the floor book, but it's the adults' input into the book.
Creating it, yeah.
But I really feel like within an early year setting, co-creating that floor book with them, then being able to have a view into what goes in there, even down to what color should we use, what color pen should we use to write the question, or what paper should we stick these photos on. It could just be as simple as that, at a young age, if we're talking early 3-year-olds. But I think as long as you've got that real visual representation of what you've done and you've showcased that research and that trajectory of learning, then you can do it however you want. You could have a working wall, you could have an interactive display, you could make a video diary. It doesn't really matter what you do, as long as you've got that I suppose showcase of what they've done and what they now can do. Because again, if you go back to the stages of inquiry, the first stage is exploring that current knowledge. So you need to be able to look through, say, a floor book and go, right, this is where they were at the beginning, this is what they knew about an emergency and how to get help. And then they can see that learning and that process that they've learned and those skills that they've been practicing throughout that 6-8 week period. And then obviously the last stage is obviously that showcase and presentation of this is what we now know. We know in an emergency we dial 999. These are the emergency services that can help us. This is what noise an ambulance makes. This is what color a fire engine is. Even simple things like that. And then reflections at the end, summarizing that learning. Right? Okay, has the learning moved on? From that starting point to that finish point. Has there been success? Has there been knowledge learn? And if so, great, carry on. If not, go back, and look at it again. So I think whatever you do and however you do it just needs to be as visual and as engaging and as immersive as possible, really.
So it's very much involving the children, and as you mentioned there, even simple things like choosing colours, pen colours for the younger children, giving them that agency over their own learning choice, allowing them to have a voice, it being on the child's level, like you say, floor books because they're on the floor. And if we have them like a display on the wall, thinking about the height, is it useful? Is it just for the adults, or is it, can the children see it? Is it valuable, useful for children? Can they engage in it? Lots of again, brings me back to reflection. Everything that we do as adults, and this approach really, really encourages that, should be reflective and critical, not just doing something for the sake of it, or this is how we've always done it. So it's really great to hear that you're really like adopting an approach like this in your settings. And I know you mentioned, I think in your article as well, that there are various settings that do adopt this approach, have done, and are kind of leading the way, and have done for years potentially as well. And that's what you should take example from. And I guess that's what you've been inspired by.
Yeah, I think that there are so many amazing settings out there that do amazing things and amazing schools. I've been speaking a lot to one of my close friends who is a primary school teacher in a Reggio Emilia inspired primary school, which often is quite unusual in itself as well. And they have continuous provision, right up until I think year 1, year 2. But even in the upper years, they have home areas, they have sofas, they have that very soft approach as well, and they have that inquiry-led curriculum. They have the investigating element. So I think a lot of those schools are, moving towards becoming centres of excellence, where kind of other schools and other settings can visit and learn from. So I think, there are, check your local areas, do your current research as well on what's around and what provisions around, and if there isn't any, you could be that early adopter of that and really set a precedent for change in terms of, immersive curriculum, really.
And as we're on the topic of different settings as well, so if any settings, if you may already work with and have worked for years with the inquiry-led approach, project-based learning, Reggio Emilia, then please share your thoughts, your practice as well, to add on to this episode and what Stuart is talking about, because it's all about learning from each other. And Stuart, as you were saying, you're kind of on this journey with your team and just kind of starting off with this approach. So it's great to hear other settings and I guess learn from their experiences as well. So it's great to reflect together.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, definitely share your thoughts and share what's working and what's not working, and what has worked, and if settings have been doing it for a number of years, how that's changed and how that's shaped, your future cohorts and your future provision, and, even down to the equipment then you buy and the resources that you buy. You'll probably become more mindful with what you're buying, in terms of that skill set. Is it going to enhance that child's skill set? Is it going to give them an opportunity to learn something they haven't learned? So I think it really fosters a sense of evolvement across many areas.
And just to kind of finish off, what are your kind of current or next steps with the approach? At what point of the journey are you on now, and the various settings that you're working with?
Yeah, so we are very early on in the stages. We've kind of created some very loose inquiry-based questions and kind of found some key texts to go along with that. So some stories that link in with that, fiction and non-fiction, and some like provocations that we can bring in. So, like paper embossers and, those old scale weights with the iron, cast iron weights and things. So it's at a very early stage, but, we're asking the question, we're getting that, we're building on that current knowledge and working on that. So I would say, yeah, very early on, but it's an exciting time for us. And we're really looking forward to moving forward with it.
Yeah, and it sounds like you are definitely equipped with all of that reflection and critical thinking, and that's the most important thing, like we kept saying. And as you just mentioned, as you go through that journey, there may be things that you change, and some of the equipment that you just mentioned now that you're getting for the settings, you might kind of look back and think, actually, is this working now, or who does it work for? Why are we getting this version and not something else? So yeah, that reflection, I guess, is just going to be constantly ongoing. It's going to be exciting hearing about your journey, and I'm sure you'll probably maybe it'll be great to have you back on in like a year's time or so and kind of say, you know what, everything that I was talking about, actually we've scrapped this, we've changed it, or like we've progressed in this way.
No, that'd be great.
And for everyone who is listening and watching, Stuart's article is available on the Voice of Early Childhood website, where he does write about the different stages, as he's kind of been mentioning on the podcast. So do have a look at that, because it's great to kind of really read the different stages, especially if you're not so familiar, but then listen back to the podcast episode again and think, okay, like I understand what we mean here now, and it's going a bit deeper. And of course, as we said, do share your thoughts, whether you are familiar with the approach or not. There's also a few other episodes that really link into this, actually, in terms of curriculum and then also observing children. So Jan Dubiel, who I mentioned earlier, has an episode with Ruth Swales on what is an early years curriculum, and they talk about some of the things we mentioned around what is an early years curriculum, and using that term and how do we structure it, and the fact that it's fluid and things like that. So that's really interesting as well. Then we have Trisha Mohammed, who talks about the skill of observation, kind of links into tuning into children's, I guess, interests and inquiries and having to think about that. And Di Chilvers talks about observing and documenting children's learning, so actually children's interests specifically. So she talks about a setting where they did document everything on this kind of like whiteboard style, where it was very fluid, kind of like what we were mentioning a little bit there, and children were involved. And we've got lots of things around like curriculum and planning and observations, actually. A really interesting project which is ongoing, and I guess it's almost a bit similar to what you're doing now, Stuart, with your team. This is Durham Curriculum Project. They've got lots of various schools involved, and they're going on a kind of curriculum journey and really developing their curriculum and understanding and their leadership around this. So that's a really interesting one as well to follow, and there's different episodes on that and articles. But all in all, it's just great to hear educators really embracing kind of curriculum, observations, planning, all of these things, and being really reflective and brave to change things up like you are with your settings, with your teams. And I think that's just a really great example to everyone, to say we're trying something new and we're really looking into it, reading about it, researching, approaching different settings, reflecting, being critical of ourselves and everything else out there. Is definitely something that I think a lot of educators and settings out there should look up to. And yeah, thank you for sharing all of your work. And it's, I think for me, it's really inspiring hearing the kind of the journey you're on and the thinking and, that mindset. So I'm sure it will be for lots of other listeners and viewers as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you having me on and me being able to speak about it.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks again very, very much. Everyone who's listening, links to the articles I mentioned, Stuart's article and different podcast episodes are in the episode description. So do listen. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again, Stuart, on your journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.